The morning fog clung to the cobblestones of Charleston's medical district on October 12, 1841, and Dr. Samuel Cartwright's surgical knife froze mid-incision. He'd performed hundreds of autopsies in his career, documented dozens of unusual cases, published papers that made him one of the most respected physicians in the South. But he'd never seen anything like this. The brain on the table before him, preserved in formaldehyde, sectioned with surgical precision, showed structural abnormalities that shouldn't exist. The temporal lobes were enlarged, nearly twice normal size. The auditory cortex showed unusual density. Most striking were the neural pathways connecting the language centers to sensory processing areas, pathways that modern neuroscience wouldn't identify for another 150 years. The brain had belonged to a 19-year-old enslaved girl named Mercy, who died 3 days earlier under circumstances the medical establishment would spend decades trying to explain away. Mercy had possessed an ability that terrified everyone who witnessed it. She could communicate with animals, not train them, not merely understand their behaviors, communicate with them in ways that seemed to bypass human language entirely. Within a week of Dr. Cartwright's autopsy, his notes would be confiscated by Charleston authorities. Within a month, every witness to Mercy's abilities would be warned to never speak of her again. The medical college would seal all records related to her case. The plantation where she'd lived would burn to the ground in a fire deemed accidental by investigators who asked no questions. What happened in that autopsy room didn't just challenge medical understanding. It threatened the entire philosophical and religious foundation that justified slavery itself. Because if an enslaved girl possessed neurological capabilities that exceeded those of her masters, what did that say about the natural order? What did that say about the lies society was built upon? They couldn't let that question be asked, so they erased the girl, burned the evidence, and buried the truth. But they couldn't bury it completely. October had arrived cool and damp in Charleston that year, bringing relief from the oppressive summer heat that turned the lowlands into a fever-breeding swamp. Mercy was 19 years old, small and wiry, with skin the color of polished ebony and eyes that people described as unnervingly aware. She'd been born on Blackwood Plantation, 40 miles north of Charleston, property of Colonel William Blackwood, a man who owned 247 human beings and considered himself a benevolent master because he only whipped his slaves when they required correction. Mercy's mother, Ruth, had died in childbirth. The midwife who delivered Mercy, an elderly enslaved woman named Aunt Bess, would later testify that the baby hadn't cried. Instead, she'd made sounds that seemed like responses to birds calling outside the window, as though she were already trying to communicate with something other than humans. "I thought she was touched," Aunt Bess recalled, "touched by something not of this world. I told the colonel's wife we should watch that child carefully." They did watch her, and what they saw disturbed them. Mercy didn't speak her first human word until she was nearly 4 years old, far later than normal. But from infancy, she made sounds, clicks, whistles, low humming tones that seemed to mean something to the animals around her. The plantation dogs would come when she called with a specific whistle. Horses would calm when she hummed. Birds would land near her when she made clicking sounds with her tongue. The overseer, a brutal man named Silas Crawford, thought she was playing tricks. He beat her once for wasting time making noise instead of working. The plantation's 3 dogs, normally vicious animals used to track runaway slaves, attacked Crawford so viciously he nearly died. They'd never attacked anyone before. After Mercy made a series of sharp barking sounds, the dogs stopped immediately and retreated. She was 6 years old. After that incident, people gave Mercy a wide berth. The other enslaved people thought she had power, protection from spirits. The white overseers thought she was dangerous, unnatural, but useful. Colonel Blackwood, a practical man who cared more about productivity than superstition, assigned Mercy to work with the plantation's livestock. She was extraordinary at it. According to plantation records, after Mercy began managing the animals, livestock mortality dropped by 60%. Horses that had been considered untrainable became docile under her care. Pigs that had been aggressive and difficult to handle became manageable. Even the plantation's chickens seemed to lay more eggs when Mercy was nearby. She didn't train the animals in any conventional sense. She didn't use food rewards or punishment. She simply communicated with them. She'd make sounds, sometimes vocalizations, sometimes gestures, sometimes just a look, and the animals would respond as though they understood complex instructions. A stable hand named Joseph, who worked alongside Mercy for years, later described it. It wasn't like watching someone handle animals. It was like watching someone have a conversation, only nobody was speaking words. She'd make a sound, the horse would respond with a sound, she'd respond back and forth. And then the horse would do exactly what she wanted. It was unnatural, but it was also beautiful. Mercy's abilities extended beyond domestic animals. Wild birds would land on her shoulders. Deer would approach her in the fields without fear. Once, a copperhead snake, one of the most dangerous snakes in South Carolina, coiled near her foot while she was working. Instead of running or killing it, she made a series of hissing sounds. The snake uncoiled and slithered away peacefully. Aunt Bess, who'd helped raise Mercy, believed the girl could hear things humans couldn't hear. She'd turn her head like she was listening to something, but there'd be no sound. Then a minute later, a fox would come out of the woods, or a hawk would circle overhead. She heard them before they were there, heard them calling from somewhere we couldn't reach. By the time Mercy was 15, her reputation had spread beyond Blackwood Plantation. Other plantation owners would send their problem animals to Colonel Blackwood, paying him to let the animal girl work her strange magic. Blackwood, recognizing a profitable opportunity, began hearing Mercy out. This brought her to the attention of people who asked uncomfortable questions. In 1838, a naturalist from Philadelphia named Dr. Herbert Mason visited Blackwood Plantation to study the region's wildlife. He'd heard rumors about an enslaved girl who could communicate with animals and dismissed them as plantation folklore. Then he witnessed Mercy work. Dr. Mason's journal entry from March 15, 1838, describes the experience. I observed the girl called Mercy interact with a wild hawk that had been caught in a farmer's trap and brought to the plantation. The bird was violent, attacking anyone who approached. The girl approached without hesitation. She made a series of high-pitched sounds, not words, but deliberate vocalizations that seemed to mimic raptor calls. The hawk stopped struggling. She continued making sounds, varying the pitch and rhythm. The hawk responded with its own calls. This exchange continued for perhaps 5 minutes. Then the girl opened the trap. The hawk did not attack. It stepped onto her arm, allowed her to examine its injured wing, and remained calm while she applied a poultice. I cannot explain what I witnessed. It defies conventional understanding of animal behavior and human capability. Dr. Mason tried to study Mercy further, but Colonel Blackwood refused. "She's my property, not a circus attraction," he'd said. But the real reason, Dr. Mason suspected, was fear. Fear of what deeper investigation might reveal. Dr. Mason returned to Philadelphia and wrote a paper describing Mercy's abilities for the American Journal of Natural Sciences. The paper was rejected without review. The editor sent a personal note. Claims of enslaved Negroes possessing supernatural abilities are not appropriate for scientific publication. They promote dangerous ideas about racial equality. The paper was never published, but it circulated privately among scientists and physicians, generating fascination and controversy. One of those who read it was Dr. Samuel Cartwright. Dr. Cartwright was a prominent physician from Louisiana, known for his work on diseases peculiar to the Negro race. He'd coined the term drapetomania, the supposed mental illness that caused slaves to run away, and argued that black people were biologically different from whites, designed by nature for servitude. His racial theories were used to justify slavery as a medical and moral necessity. When Dr. Cartwright read Dr. Mason's account of Mercy, he saw an opportunity. If he could prove that her abilities were the result of some neurological defect, some abnormality that made her more animal than human, it would support his theories about racial differences. He wrote to Colonel Blackwood requesting permission to examine Mercy. Blackwood was initially reluctant, but Dr. Cartwright was persuasive. He offered to pay $500, a substantial sum, just for the opportunity to observe and test Mercy for 1 week. He promised that his findings would be used to advance scientific understanding of the Negro brain, which would ultimately help plantation owners better manage their slaves. Blackwood agreed. In September 1841, Mercy was sent to Charleston to be examined by Dr. Cartwright. She never returned to Blackwood Plantation. Mercy arrived in Charleston on September 20th, 1841, accompanied by an overseer who delivered her to the Medical College of South Carolina, where Dr. Cartwright had arranged to conduct his examination. She was housed in a basement room used for storing supplies, given a thin mattress and a bucket for waste. She was not told why she was there or what would happen to her. She was property. Property didn't require explanations. Dr. Cartwright began his examination on September 22nd. His approach was methodical. He measured Mercy's skull with calipers, documented her physical characteristics, tested her reflexes and responses to stimuli. He was looking for evidence of inferiority, of difference that would confirm his beliefs about racial hierarchy. Instead, he found something that troubled him. Mercy's cranial measurements were within normal range, in fact, slightly above average. Her reflexes were excellent. Her vision and hearing appeared normal. There was no obvious physical abnormality that would explain her abilities. On September 24th, Dr. Cartwright decided to test those abilities directly. He arranged for various animals to be brought to the college: a dog, a cat, a chicken, a pig, and a caged wild raccoon. What happened next was documented by 3 witnesses: Dr. Cartwright himself, his assistant Dr. James Thornton, and a medical student named William Hayes. Mercy was brought into the examination room and presented with the dog first, a medium-sized mongrel that had been deliberately starved and agitated to make it aggressive. The dog growled and lunged when orderlies brought it in. Dr. Cartwright instructed Mercy to calm the animal. She looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she turned to the dog. She made a sound, a low, rumbling vocalization that seemed to come from deep in her chest. The dog's ears perked up. She made the sound again, varying the pitch slightly. The dog stopped growling. She continued, creating a series of sounds that seemed like a conversation, though no words were spoken. Within 3 minutes, the dog was sitting calmly. Within 5, it was eating from her hand. Within 10, it was lying beside her, relaxed and docile. Dr. Thornton's notes describe his reaction. "I have witnessed animal training before, but this was different. It was as though she and the dog were speaking a language neither of them should have known. Most disturbing was the dog's behavior afterward. It refused to leave her side and became agitated when we tried to separate them. The pattern repeated with each animal. The cat, the pig, the chicken, all responded to Mercy's vocalizations and gestures, but the most dramatic demonstration came with the raccoon. Raccoons are notoriously aggressive when caged. This one had been trapped in the wild and was violent, attacking the cage bars and hissing at anyone who approached. Dr. Cartwright expected Mercy to fail with this animal, which would prove his theory that her abilities were limited to domestic animals she'd worked with previously. Instead, Mercy approached the cage and began making chirping, chattering sounds, vocalizations that closely mimicked raccoon sounds, but with variations that seemed intentional, structured. The raccoon stopped attacking the bars. It moved to the front of the cage, watching her intently. She continued making sounds, and the raccoon responded with its own vocalizations. This exchange continued for nearly 15 minutes. Then Mercy opened the cage. Dr. Cartwright tried to stop her, certain the raccoon would attack, but she ignored him. The raccoon climbed out of the cage onto her arm and sat there calmly while she stroked its fur. She made soft sounds. The raccoon responded. To the witnesses, it looked exactly like a conversation. William Hayes, the medical student, wrote in his journal, "I do not believe in magic, but I cannot explain what I saw by any scientific principle I have learned. Either this girl possesses some unknown sense that allows her to perceive and communicate on a level we do not understand, or there is something about consciousness and communication that our entire scientific framework has failed to comprehend." Dr. Cartwright was shaken. This wasn't evidence of inferiority. This was evidence of a capability that exceeded normal human ability. This was evolution in the wrong direction, at least according to his theories. He decided to test Mercy further. Over the next week, he brought in more animals: a fox, an owl, a snake, even an alligator from the nearby swamps. In every case, Mercy demonstrated the ability to communicate with and calm the animals in ways that defied explanation. Dr. Cartwright began to realize that his study was producing results he couldn't publish. If he reported that an enslaved girl possessed neurological abilities superior to white humans, it would undermine the entire scientific justification for slavery. It would suggest that the racial hierarchy was a lie. But he was also fascinated. He wanted to understand the mechanism behind Mercy's abilities. He consulted with colleagues. He reviewed medical literature. He considered every possible explanation. And then he made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. On October 5, 1841, Dr. Cartwright proposed to his colleagues that they perform an experimental procedure on Mercy. They would surgically expose her brain while she was alive, under minimal anesthesia, and stimulate different regions to see if they could identify the source of her abilities. It was called vivisection, experimentation on a living subject. "The slave is property of Colonel Blackwood," Dr. Cartwright argued. "He has given us permission to study her. We have a rare opportunity to advance medical science. If she dies in the process, it is no different than dissecting a horse to understand its anatomy." Dr. Thornton objected. "She's a human being, Samuel. What you're proposing is torture." "She is a Negro slave," Dr. Cartwright replied. "The law does not grant her the protections of a human being in the full sense, and if we can understand the abnormality in her brain, we may be able to identify similar defects in other slaves and develop treatments." The debate continued for days. Most of the medical staff were uncomfortable with the proposal, but they also recognized that legally, Dr. Cartwright was correct. Enslaved people had no legal rights. Consent was not required. On October 9th, the college's board of directors approved the vivisection procedure. But something happened that no one anticipated. On October 10th, the night before the scheduled surgery, Mercy stopped eating. She refused all food and water. When orderlies tried to force-feed her, she resisted violently, something she'd never done before. By the morning of October 11th, she was weak but conscious. Dr. Cartwright decided to proceed anyway. They brought Mercy to the surgical theater, an amphitheater-style room where students observed procedures. 23 people were present: physicians, medical students, and several local doctors who'd heard about the unusual case. Mercy was strapped to the surgical table. Minimal ether was administered, enough to dull pain but not enough to render her unconscious, because they needed her conscious to test her responses. Dr. Cartwright made the first incision at 9:17 a.m. What happened next was documented by multiple witnesses, though their accounts vary in details. What's consistent is that as soon as the incision was made, Mercy began making sounds. Not screams of pain, though she must have been in agony. Strange, modulated vocalizations that seemed to contain patterns, rhythms, meanings. The animals responded. Throughout the medical college, every animal began reacting. Dogs in the kennels began howling. Horses in the stables began kicking their stalls. Birds outside the building began calling loudly. Even rats in the walls began moving, their skittering audible through the building. William Hayes wrote, "It was as though she was calling them, screaming for help in a language they understood but we could not hear. The sound was overwhelming, chaotic. Several students fled the theater. Dr. Cartwright tried to continue, but the animal's response was so disruptive that security had to be called to control the situation. The surgery continued for 37 minutes. In that time, Dr. Cartwright exposed Mercy's brain, observing and documenting the unusual structures he found. He tried to stimulate different regions with electrical probes, watching for responses. Mercy remained conscious through most of it, making those strange sounds, calling to creatures that couldn't save her. At 9:54 a.m., her heart stopped. The official cause of death was listed as surgical complications. No mention was made of the vivisection or its true purpose. Dr. Cartwright immediately began preserving Mercy's brain for autopsy. He wanted to understand the structures he'd glimpsed during surgery. And what he found when he sectioned and examined the brain over the following days was extraordinary. His notes, which would later be confiscated but partially survive in private correspondence, describe findings that wouldn't be understood for over a century. The temporal lobes show significant enlargement, particularly in regions associated with auditory processing. The neural density in these areas exceeds anything I have observed in previous dissections. Most remarkable are the connections between the auditory cortex and the language centers, pathways that appear to be developed far beyond normal human anatomy. If I am correct in my interpretation, this individual's brain was structured to process sound at a level of complexity that far exceeds typical human capability. She was hearing and processing information that most humans cannot perceive, and she had developed the ability to produce vocalizations that mimicked and communicated with non-human species. Dr. Cartwright realized that Mercy hadn't been defective. She'd been advanced, neurologically evolved in a way that gave her abilities most humans didn't possess. She wasn't less than human. She was potentially more. This finding terrified him. Because if an enslaved black girl could be neurologically superior to white men, then everything he'd spent his career arguing, everything that justified his social position and the institution of slavery, was wrong. He destroyed most of his notes. He kept only fragments hidden in personal correspondence. On October 15, 1841, representatives from the Charleston city government visited the medical college. They informed Dr. Cartwright that his study of the animal girl had attracted unwanted attention. Rumors were spreading about unusual experiments. Abolitionists in the North had somehow heard about Mercy and were asking questions. The city couldn't afford a scandal. Slavery was under increasing moral attack. The last thing they needed was a scientific study suggesting that enslaved people might possess superior abilities. All records related to Mercy were to be confiscated and sealed. Dr. Cartwright was to cease all discussion of the case. The brain specimen was to be destroyed. Dr. Cartwright complied. He had no choice. The brain was incinerated. The surgical theater where Mercy died was scrubbed and repainted. The basement room where she'd been kept was emptied and locked. Witnesses were warned that discussing the case could result in charges of spreading seditious information, a crime that carried prison sentences. Dr. Cartwright returned to Louisiana. He never published his findings about Mercy. He never spoke publicly about what he'd discovered, but his later writings show a subtle shift in tone. He stopped making absolute claims about Negro inferiority. He began using more cautious language, more qualifications. His colleagues noticed. Some whispered that Dr. Cartwright had gone soft on the slavery question. He lost some of his influence in pro-slavery medical circles. In 1857, in a private letter to a colleague, Dr. Cartwright wrote, "I have witnessed things in my career that I cannot explain, that do not fit the theories I have spent my life defending. I sometimes wonder if we have built our entire society on assumptions that will one day be proven catastrophically wrong. But by then, it will be too late for men like me to claim ignorance. We will be judged, and that judgment will be harsh." Dr. Cartwright died in 1863, as the Civil War raged and the institution he defended scientifically crumbled. Mercy's story didn't end with her death. Fragments survived, passed down through oral tradition among the enslaved community, whispered as a warning and a mystery. The people who'd known Mercy at Blackwood Plantation remembered her. After slavery ended, some of them told their stories to folklorists and historians collecting accounts of plantation life. An elderly woman named Dinah, interviewed in 1902, remembered Mercy. She could talk to the animals, really talk to them, not just handle them. The white folk thought it was magic or the devil, but we knew it was a gift, something God gave her to show that we were more than what they said we were. They killed her for it. They couldn't stand that a slave girl could do something they couldn't. In 1923, a historian named Dr. Margaret Aldridge, researching medical experimentation on enslaved people, found references to the animal girl case in archived correspondence between Charleston physicians. She tried to locate official records, but found that all documents related to the case had been sealed under an old city ordinance that classified them as medically sensitive. She petitioned for access. Her petition was denied. In 1967, during the Civil Rights Movement, a journalist named Robert Chen tried to investigate historical cases of medical abuse against Black Americans. He found mention of Mercy in private letters held by Dr. Cartwright's descendants. The family refused to provide access to the full collection. Chen published what he could find, a brief article noting that an enslaved girl with unusual abilities had been subjected to experimental surgery in Charleston in 1841. The article generated some attention, but was quickly overshadowed by more immediate civil rights stories. In 1998, the Medical College of South Carolina issued a formal apology for its historical involvement in unethical medical experimentation on enslaved people. The apology mentioned several cases by name. Mercy was not among them, because officially her case didn't exist. It wasn't until 2015 that the full story began to emerge. Dr. Nina Chambers, a neuroscientist at Duke University, was researching historical cases of unusual neurological conditions. She obtained access to private medical collections and found Dr. Cartwright's preserved correspondence, including his fragmentary notes about Mercy's brain. Reading those notes, Dr. Chambers recognized something that Dr. Cartwright couldn't have understood in 1841. The neurological structures he was describing matched what modern science calls enhanced auditory processing capability and cross-modal neuroplasticity, conditions where the brain develops unusual connections that allow for perception and processing beyond typical human ranges. What Dr. Cartwright found in Mercy's brain, Dr. Chambers explained in a 2017 paper, was evidence of a neurological variant that we now know exists in a small percentage of humans. These individuals have heightened ability to perceive, process, and produce complex acoustic patterns. They can hear frequencies and nuances that most humans miss. With training, they can learn to communicate with animals on a level that seems almost supernatural, but it's actually neurological. Their brains are simply structured differently. Dr. Chambers' paper noted that such variants appear across all human populations, all races. There was nothing uniquely Negro about Mercy's brain, as Dr. Cartwright had been trying to prove. She was simply a human being with a rare neurological gift. The tragedy, Dr. Chambers wrote, is that instead of studying and nurturing this gift, the medical establishment of 1841 saw it as a threat. They killed her because she contradicted the lie that black people were inferior. Her death was not just murder, it was the suppression of human potential in service of racial hierarchy. Dr. Chambers' paper sparked renewed interest in Mercy's case. Other historians began digging. Documents that had been sealed for 174 years were finally released under pressure from academic and civil rights groups. What emerged was a fuller picture. Mercy had been one of dozens of enslaved people subjected to medical experimentation in Charleston during the antebellum period. But she was unique in that her abilities were documented, and her case was deliberately suppressed specifically because the findings contradicted pro-slavery ideology. In 2019, the Medical College of South Carolina held a memorial service for Mercy and other victims of medical experimentation. A plaque was installed. In memory of Mercy, 1822-1841, enslaved woman, whose extraordinary abilities threatened a system built on lies. She was silenced, but her story survives as testimony to both the cruelty of slavery and the inerasable dignity of the human spirit. It's a nice gesture, but Mercy isn't there to see it. She's buried somewhere in Charleston, possibly in a mass grave for enslaved people, possibly in an unmarked plot behind the medical college, possibly in a location that was deliberately obscured to prevent her grave from becoming a site of remembrance. We don't know where she is. We only know what they did to her. Why did they kill her? The answer is simple and horrifying. Mercy's existence, her abilities, her neurological structure, her proof that enslaved black people could possess capabilities that exceeded those of their masters, was incompatible with the ideology that justified slavery. Slavery required the belief that black people were inherently inferior, less intelligent, less capable, less human. That belief was supported by religion, by law, by science, by every institution in Southern society. Mercy contradicted that belief simply by existing. If she could do things that white people couldn't do, if her brain was structured in ways that made her neurologically advanced rather than deficient, then what did that say about natural racial hierarchy? What did that say about the moral justification for holding human beings as property? The system couldn't tolerate that question, so it eliminated the evidence. They vivisected her brain looking for proof of inferiority and found proof of advancement. So they destroyed the specimen, sealed the records, threatened the witnesses, and erased her from history. It was easier to kill one girl than to question the entire foundation of their society. But here's what they couldn't destroy: the truth that Mercy's abilities were real, that her brain was extraordinary, that she represented human potential that the system had tried to crush but couldn't eliminate. Modern neuroscience confirms that abilities like Mercy's exist. There are people alive today with enhanced auditory processing, with unusual neural structures that give them capabilities most humans don't have. Some work as animal behaviorists. Some work in fields requiring acute acoustic perception. Some simply live their lives, unaware that they possess something rare. These abilities appear in all populations, all races. They're not markers of superiority or inferiority. They're simply human variation, the diversity that makes our species adaptable and resilient. Mercy wasn't a freak. She wasn't possessed. She wasn't a medical oddity. She was a human being with a gift, and she was murdered for it. You're watching this video, which means you now know what they tried to bury. Mercy, an enslaved girl of 19, possessed neurological abilities that should have been studied, celebrated, and honored. Instead, she was vivisected, killed, and erased from history because her existence threatened the lie that justified slavery. She died in agony on a surgical table, calling out to animals that couldn't save her, while men who called themselves scientists destroyed her brain looking for evidence to justify their cruelty. She died alone. She died in pain. She died believing that no one would remember her. If that makes you rage, and it should, then use that rage. Hit the like button. Every like is an act of witness, a refusal to let mercy stay buried in forgotten history. Share this video. Every share is resistance against the institutions that tried to erase her existence. Write in the comments, "Mercy deserved better," 3 words that restore her humanity, that acknowledge what was stolen from her. Subscribe to this channel because Mercy is not the only one. There are other stories buried in the dark history of slavery, medical experimentation, and institutional violence against black bodies. Stories of women whose bodies were used for medical advancement without consent. Stories of children whose abilities threatened the system and were destroyed for it. Stories of brilliance, of resistance, of humanity that slavery tried to crush but couldn't eliminate. I'm bringing those stories into the light, one at a time, and I need you to be part of this. We can't change what happened to Mercy. We can't give her back the life that was stolen, the recognition she deserved, the future where her gifts could have been used to advance science and understanding. But we can say her name, Mercy, daughter of Ruth, 19 years old, extraordinary, murdered, not forgotten. They wanted you to never know she existed, but now you know. The animals she spoke to couldn't save her, but we can save her memory. Share her story. Make people uncomfortable. Make them confront the reality that slavery wasn't just about labor exploitation. It was about the systematic destruction of human potential whenever that potential threatened white supremacy. Ask yourself, if you'd been there in 1841, would you have fought for mercy? You can't answer that about the past, but you can answer it about the present. Because the systems that killed mercy, systems that value maintaining hierarchy over recognizing human worth, systems that destroy what they fear rather than learn from it, those systems still exist. They've evolved, they've adapted, but they're still destroying brilliant minds, still crushing potential, still silencing voices that threaten comfortable lies. Will you stay silent or will you fight? Mercy is calling to you across 183 years, not in human language but in something deeper, the universal language of injustice crying out for witness, for memory, for justice that comes too late but still matters. Answer her call, remember her, and make sure her death meant something by refusing to let the systems that killed her continue unchallenged. Say her name, Mercy. She existed, she mattered, she will not be forgotten again.